For months, Buckingham Palace insisted everything surrounding Prince Philip's final affairs had been handled quietly and according to tradition. But behind closed doors, one sealed legal document was waiting to be opened. And when royal lawyers finally broke the wax seal, the room reportedly fell silent, because what they read inside didn't just surprise the family, it challenged one of the monarchy's oldest expectations. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the tense days following the passing of Prince Philip, the royal household moved carefully, almost ritualistically, through the long-established procedures that govern royal estates and final directives. Everything about the moment carried the unmistakable gravity of tradition. Advisors spoke in quiet tones, legal documents were reviewed with surgical precision, and every step unfolded behind closed doors, far from public scrutiny. In the world of the monarchy, very little is left to chance, especially when it concerns the personal affairs of a man who spent decades shaping the modern royal institution. Those present understood that this meeting was not merely administrative. It was the final chapter of Philip's personal legacy. The expectation inside the room seemed almost predetermined. For generations, matters of this magnitude were typically handled by the heir or the reigning monarch. It was widely assumed that King Charles III, as the eldest son and now the sovereign, would naturally take responsibility for overseeing the execution of his father's personal estate. The logic was simple. Authority flowed downward through the royal hierarchy, and Charles stood at the very top. But beneath that assumption lingered an undercurrent of quiet uncertainty. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, whispers had begun circulating among palace advisors that Philip had left unusually detailed legal instructions. Some described the documents as meticulous, others called them surprisingly personal. As the lawyers prepared to open the sealed directive, the atmosphere reportedly shifted, even among seasoned royal staff, accustomed to the solemn rituals of the crown. There was a sense that something unexpected might emerge. Philip had always been known for his discipline, his decisiveness, and his refusal to follow convention when he believed something else served the monarchy better. Those who had worked closely with him understood that his final instructions would likely reflect that same uncompromising mindset. Then the moment arrived. The document was opened, the clause was read aloud, and the silence that followed was immediate and unmistakable. According to those familiar with the meeting, the revelation landed with the quiet force of a thunderclap. Prince Philip had not named Charles as the executor of his estate. Instead, the responsibility had been entrusted entirely to Prince Edward. For a brief moment, the words seemed almost difficult to process. The executor role was not a ceremonial title. It was a position of immense legal authority, granting control over the late Duke's personal estate, private documents, and the execution of his final directives. It was a role that demanded trust, discretion, and absolute loyalty to the wishes of the person who had written the will. And Philip had chosen Edward. Within that small gathering of lawyers and royal advisors, the implications were immediately understood. This was not simply a technical detail buried inside a legal document. It was a decision that shifted the quiet balance of responsibility within the royal family. The youngest son, long known for maintaining a lower public profile, had been entrusted with carrying out Philip's final intentions. Speculation began almost instantly. Some wondered if the choice had been purely practical. Edward had often been described by insiders as methodical, discreet, and deeply respectful of protocol. Others suspected the decision carried a more personal meaning. After all, Philip had lived his life surrounded by the complexities of royal duty and family dynamics. Every decision he made was deliberate. Royal historians would later begin examining the move through a wider lens. Was Philip attempting to avoid placing Charles in the difficult position of administering sensitive family matters? Or was the decision a reflection of something deeper within their private relationships? Inside the palace, no one could ignore the question that now lingered in every corridor. A father had made a final choice about trust and responsibility, and that choice had bypassed the future king. But the question that immediately haunted the palace corridors was impossible to ignore. Why would Philip bypass the future king and instead entrust everything to his youngest son? To many outside observers, the choice seemed baffling. After all, Edward had never been the dominant public figure among Philip's sons. He was the quiet one, the careful one, often working behind the scenes. Yet inside palace walls, some insiders claim Philip viewed Edward very differently. And according to those who knew him best, the Duke had long believed Edward possessed something the monarchy desperately needed. In the days after the revelation of Prince Philip's executor decision began circulating quietly among royal advisors, attention slowly shifted toward the man now standing at the center of it all. Prince Edward had never been the loudest voice within the royal family. In fact, for most of his life, he seemed to exist in a quieter orbit, moving steadily through royal duties without attracting the kind of scrutiny that often followed his older brothers. As the youngest son of Philip and Queen Elizabeth II, Edward had grown up in the shadow of immense expectations placed upon the monarchy's future. Yet, unlike his siblings, he rarely appeared caught in the turbulence of public controversy. To the outside world, he was often perceived as the most understated member of the royal siblings, reliable, disciplined, and largely removed from the storms that sometimes surrounded the institution. For years, Edward's lower profile meant he rarely dominated headlines. Public attention tended to gravitate toward Prince Charles, whose path to the throne had always carried enormous weight, or Prince Andrew, whose life frequently intersected with intense public scrutiny. Edward, by contrast, seemed to exist on the quieter edges of royal life, but within the private world of the palace, that calm reputation was not seen as a weakness. According to those who had worked closely with the family, Philip often valued exactly that quality. In the Duke of Edinburgh's later years, insiders suggest Edward became one of the sons Philip spoke with most regularly about practical matters. While public appearances and ceremonies continued to define royal life on the surface, behind the scenes there were countless logistical details, private decisions, and administrative questions that required careful attention. Those familiar with the family's internal dynamics say Edward often stepped forward during these moments not with grand gestures, but with steady reliability. Royal staff members who observed the father and son relationship during those years sometimes described it in simple but telling terms. They claimed Philip trusted Edward to approach difficult matters without allowing emotion to cloud judgment. That quality, they believed, mattered enormously when dealing with sensitive family documents, private correspondence, and decisions that could affect not only the family, but the institution itself. In a household where every decision carried historical weight, emotional distance could sometimes be an advantage. There were even quiet hints, shared only among a handful of trusted advisors, that Edward had already been assisting Philip with certain estate matters long before the Duke's passing, not in a formal capacity, but through conversations, document reviews, and discussions about how certain personal affairs should eventually be handled. If those accounts were accurate, then Philip's decision to name Edward Executor may not have been a sudden or impulsive choice. It may have been the final step in a plan that had been quietly unfolding for years. Analysts who later studied the situation offered another possible explanation. By placing the responsibility in Edward's hands, Philip may have been trying to ensure that the execution of his final directives would remain separate from the pressures of the throne. Charles, now king, carried the immense burden of leading the monarchy itself. Edward, meanwhile, stood slightly outside that intense spotlight. That distance could provide neutrality, something invaluable when navigating delicate family matters. But even as observers began to understand the practical reasoning behind Philip's decision, another question quietly lingered beneath the surface. Because in a family defined by hierarchy and tradition, every choice carries meaning. And when the future king is bypassed for such a deeply personal responsibility, speculation becomes unavoidable. Yet, while Edward's quiet reliability may have impressed Philip, the choice raised an even more uncomfortable question for royal observers. What did this decision say about Charles? Behind the formal photographs and ceremonial appearances, the relationship between Philip and his eldest son had always been complex. Admirers saw duty and discipline. Critics saw distance and disagreement. And now, with one unexpected legal decision, old questions about their bond were resurfacing. Because for many royal watchers, Philip's final choice seemed less like administrative planning and more like a deeply personal message. The revelation that Prince Philip had entrusted Prince Edward with the responsibility of executor inevitably pulled attention toward another relationship inside the royal family, one that had been discussed quietly for decades. The bond between Philip and his eldest son, King Charles III, was never easily defined. From the outside, the two men appeared united by duty, bound by a shared understanding of the monarchy's immense weight. Yet those who had observed their interactions over the years often sensed something more complicated beneath the surface. Respect was present, certainly, but so was tension, the kind that grows slowly between two generations, shaped by very different experiences. Philip belonged to a world forged by discipline and survival. His life had been defined by naval service, wartime resilience, and a relentless belief that strength was the foundation of leadership. The monarchy, in his mind, required toughness and unwavering sense of responsibility that could withstand criticism, pressure, and the constant scrutiny of public life. Charles, however, represented a different era entirely. Thoughtful and introspective, he had always shown interest in subjects that Philip sometimes regarded with skepticism. Environmental causes, philosophical reflection, and emotional openness shaped Charles's identity in ways that contrasted sharply with his father's more stoic worldview. Inside palace walls, this difference was often described as a generational divide rather than outright conflict. Philip expected resilience above all else, and he believed the future king needed to develop the strength required to carry the crown's burdens. According to those who worked close to the family, Philip occasionally pushed Charles harder than anyone else in his life. Some interpreted that as harshness, others believed it was simply the demanding guidance of a father determined to prepare his son for the most difficult role in Britain. Stories circulated quietly among royal staff for years, moments when Philip's blunt honesty forced Charles to confront expectations that few people outside the royal household could truly understand. These encounters were not always comfortable, yet they reflected a deeper truth about their relationship. Philip believed that leadership required an emotional armor, and he wanted Charles to possess it before the throne became his responsibility. Against that backdrop, Philip's final legal decision now appeared layered with meaning. Some analysts suggested the executor choice had little to do with personal criticism and everything to do with practicality. Charles was now king. Placing the role of executor upon him could have entangled the monarch in complicated legal and family matters situations that might blur the line between personal obligation and constitutional duty. By appointing Edward, Philip may have been protecting the institution from unnecessary complications. Others saw a more emotional possibility. Handling the intimate details of a parent's estate can involve painful decisions, particularly when private letters, personal possessions, or delicate family matters are involved. Perhaps Philip believed removing Charles from that process would spare him unnecessary strain during a period already defined by enormous responsibility. Yet, even with these explanations, the symbolism could not be ignored. The eldest son, now sovereign, had not been chosen to carry out his father's final administrative authority. In a family where every decision echoes through tradition and hierarchy, such a choice inevitably invites interpretation. It forces observers to ask whether Philip's decision was merely strategic or whether it reflected something more personal about the complicated bond between father and heir. And as these questions quietly spread through royal circles, the weight of the revelation was only beginning to be understood. Because while the initial disclosure had stunned those present in that private legal meeting, the rest of the royal family had not yet fully absorbed what Philip's decision truly meant. That the real shock hadn't yet reached the wider royal family, because once the document's contents spread beyond that initial room, reactions inside the palace became impossible to contain. In royal life, surprises are rare. Protocol dictates almost everything. Yet when word began circulating that Edward, not Charles, held executor authority over Philip's final wishes, the palace atmosphere reportedly shifted overnight. Conversations became guarded. Advisors scrambled to interpret the legal implications, and several senior royals were suddenly forced to confront a possibility they had never considered. At first, the revelation moved quietly, almost cautiously, through the inner corridors of royal life. Within the monarchy, news rarely travels loudly. Instead, It spreads through carefully measured conversations, discreet briefings, and private discussions between those entrusted with the Crown's most sensitive matters. But even in that controlled environment, the news of Philip's executor decision carried a kind of quiet shock that could not easily be contained. The first to absorb the information were the senior members of the royal family, the individuals most closely tied to the institution's daily responsibilities. Princess Anne, known for her sharp instincts and unwavering commitment to duty, reportedly listened to the explanation with intense focus. For someone who had spent her entire life navigating the complicated mechanics of the monarchy, the significance of Philip's decision was immediately clear. Yet rather than reacting with surprise, some insiders suggest Anne approached the revelation with a calm practicality. According to those familiar with her thinking, she understood something many outsiders might overlook. Philip rarely made decisions impulsively. If he had chosen Edward for this role, there was likely a deliberate reason behind it. Prince William also became aware of the situation as the information quietly expanded beyond the initial legal meeting. For the next generation of the monarchy, the executor decision carried its own layer of meaning. William had grown up observing the careful balance between family and institution, between private loyalty and public responsibility. The idea that Edward now held authority over Philip's final directives raised questions not only about family dynamics, but about how those directives might shape future royal decisions. Inside the palace, conversations began to take on a more cautious tone. Advisors and legal experts worked methodically to interpret what the appointment actually meant. Some worried about perception. The royal family had long been aware that even small details could trigger waves of public speculation. If the news became widely known, observers might immediately assume tension between Philip and Charles, whether that assumption reflected reality or not. Yet the legal experts were quick to emphasize an important distinction. Being named executor did not alter the established hierarchy of the monarchy. Charles remained king. His authority as sovereign was unquestionable. The executor role simply involved managing Philip's personal estate and ensuring his final wishes were carried out exactly as he had written them. In practical terms, the appointment gave Edward responsibility over documents, possessions, and directives left behind by the Duke of Edinburgh. But symbolism carries extraordinary power within the royal family. Titles, gestures, and decisions often speak far louder than the words written in official statements. The idea that Philip had entrusted Edward with this responsibility inevitably sparked speculation about the motivations behind the choice. Some wondered whether the role involved more than routine administrative tasks. Executors often oversee private letters, personal archives, and sensitive family documents materials that may contain reflections, instructions, or decisions intended only for a select group of people. If Philip had left behind such materials, Edward would now be the person responsible for safeguarding them. That realization quietly transformed the conversation inside palace walls. Because if Edward held control over Philip's personal directives, then he also held the responsibility of determining how those wishes would be carried out. And depending on what those documents contained, the implications could stretch far beyond the management of an estate. Gradually, the initial shock gave way to a deeper curiosity. What exactly had Philip left behind? What instructions had he written in those final documents? And why had he chosen Edward as the one person entrusted to carry them out? And as the family processed the revelation, attention quickly turned to one crucial question. What exactly was Edward now responsible for executing? Executors don't simply manage money, they carry out a person's final intentions. And when the executor is given sole authority, the responsibility becomes even greater. That's why Philip's choice suddenly became so significant, because hidden within his estate documents were reportedly instructions that only Edward would have the power to carry out, and some insiders hinted that those instructions might reshape certain royal traditions. Once the initial shock began to settle inside palace circles, the conversation gradually shifted away from the surprise of the appointment itself, and towards something far more consequential. The power that came with it. Being named executor of Prince Philip's estate was not merely a ceremonial designation, it was a position defined by legal authority, one that granted Prince Edward responsibility over some of the most private and carefully guarded elements of Philip's life. Every letter, every directive, every personal instruction left behind by the Duke of Edinburgh would now pass through Edward's hands before the world or even the family could understand its meaning. Within royal legal structures, an executor holds immense influence over how a person's final wishes are carried out. That authority can include overseeing personal assets, managing sensitive documents, and ensuring that the exact wording of the will is respected without alteration or compromise. In Philip's case, the responsibility carried an even deeper weight. The Duke had lived at the center of one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world. His private archives alone could contain decades of correspondence, reflections, and confidential communications tied to the inner workings of the monarchy. According to advisors familiar with royal estate procedures, Edward's role extended far beyond financial matters. Among the documents Philip left behind were believed to be personal letters. Among the documents Philip left behind, notes written during pivotal moments in royal history, and reflections that might reveal the Duke's unfiltered thoughts about the institution he had served for more than 70 years. Some of those papers could hold historical significance, offering insights into the private struggles and strategic decisions that shaped the royal family during times of enormous change. That possibility immediately raised a delicate concern inside the palace. The monarchy has always been built on a careful balance between transparency and discretion. Certain details of royal life are shared with the public, but many others remain sealed to protect the dignity of the institution and the individuals within it. Advisors were therefore quick to stress that discretion would be essential in handling Philip's estate. Any documents touching upon the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II or the stability of the crown would require the utmost sensitivity. Yet, the deeper Edward examined the responsibilities now resting on his shoulders, the clearer it became that Philip may have left behind more than administrative instructions. Quiet speculation began circulating among royal observers that the Duke of Edinburgh might have written personal messages intended for specific members of the family. Private letters addressed to sons, grandchildren, or trusted advisors were not unheard of in royal estates. Such messages often carried guidance, reflections, or final words meant only for those individuals. If that were the case, Edward would be the one responsible for delivering them, or perhaps deciding when the time was right for those messages to be revealed. That possibility added the layer of gravity to his role. Because sometimes the most powerful legacies are not written into public history books, but preserved inside sealed envelopes, waiting for the right moment to be opened. Observers also began to wonder whether Philip had left behind instructions regarding his personal archives themselves. Royal documents are often sealed for decades to protect sensitive information about historical events and family matters. As executor, Edward could now play a crucial role in determining what remains hidden and what might eventually be shared with historians. The realization slowly settled in among those watching the unfolding situation. Edward was no longer simply the quiet son who had avoided the spotlight for most of his life. Through Philip's decision, he had been entrusted with something far more profound: the guardianship of the Duke of Edinburgh's final words, final decisions, and perhaps even his final secrets. But as Edward quietly stepped into this powerful role, another reality began to emerge. Being entrusted with Philip's final wishes would place him at the center of one of the monarchy's most delicate moments. For Edward, the appointment wasn't a victory, it was a burden. Carrying out the final wishes of a father who shaped modern royal life meant navigating family relationships, public expectations, and deeply personal memories. And those close to Edward understood immediately that fulfilling Philip's trust might require decisions that not everyone would welcome. In the days that followed the revelation of his role, Prince Edward reportedly approached the responsibility with a quiet seriousness that surprised no one who knew him well. Those familiar with his character often describe him as careful, measured, and deeply aware of the delicate balance that defines royal life. For Edward, this was never about recognition or authority. The role of executor did not elevate him above anyone else within the royal hierarchy. Instead, it placed him in a position where every action carried emotional weight. Every decision he made would now reflect the final wishes of a father whose presence had defined the royal family for more than 7 decades. Carrying out those wishes meant confronting a collection of private documents that few people would ever be allowed to see. Letters, Instructions, reflections, each piece of paper represented a fragment of Philip's voice, preserved long after the Duke himself had fallen silent. For Edward, reading through those papers was not simply an administrative task, it was a deeply personal journey into the thoughts and priorities of a man who had shaped his life from the very beginning. Every page held the possibility of memory, guidance, or revelation. In these moments, those close to Edward say he leaned heavily on the quiet support of his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Throughout their years together, Sophie had earned a reputation within the royal family for her calm judgment and steady presence. She understood the emotional terrain Edward was now navigating, the mixture of duty, grief, and responsibility that came with honoring Philip's final instructions. Behind palace walls, their partnership became an anchor, offering Edward a space to process decisions that could affect both the family and the institution. As Edward began carefully reviewing Philip's private papers and directives, the scope of the responsibility became clearer. Being an executor required precision. The instructions left behind were not suggestions. They were binding wishes that had to be carried out faithfully. Yet within the royal family, even the most straightforward decisions could carry emotional consequences. A letter delivered too soon might reopen wounds. A document revealed too late might raise questions. Edward found himself navigating a path where legal duty and family sensitivity constantly intersected. The pressure was quiet but undeniable. With every step, Edward understood that his role now extended beyond paperwork. He had become the guardian of Philip's final intentions, the person entrusted to ensure that nothing his father had carefully written would be ignored or misunderstood. And while the responsibility remained largely invisible to the public, within royal circles, its significance was unmistakable. For a man who had spent much of his life outside the brightest glare of royal attention, the executor role also brought a subtle shift in how others viewed him. Royal observers began noticing the change almost immediately. Edward was no longer simply the youngest son who carried out duties with quiet reliability. Through Philip's decision, he had become a central figure in the closing chapter of the Duke's legacy. That transformation was not dramatic or theatrical. It unfolded quietly through conversations, consultations, and careful decisions made behind palace doors. Yet the effect was undeniable. Edward now stood at the intersection of family memory and royal responsibility, holding authority over matters that few others could fully understand. And while he carried out those responsibilities with the same quiet discipline that had defined his life, the broader world was beginning to take notice of the story unfolding behind the scenes. Yet even as Edward carried out his father's instructions quietly, the wider public would soon learn that Philip's final decision had sparked an unexpected debate about trust, loyalty, and legacy. When the news finally reached the public, it ignited instant speculation. Commentators debated Philip's motivati, royal historians revisited decades of family dynamics, and supporters of different royal figures offered their own interpretations. But beneath all the analysis lay a deeper fascination. What message had Philip intended to send with his final act of trust? The revelation spread quickly. Once it escaped the careful confines of palace conversations, what had initially been a quiet legal disclosure soon became a subject of intense global attention. Headlines appeared across international media, each attempting to decode the meaning behind Philip's final administrative decision. For many observers, the news carried the irresistible allure of a royal mystery. The monarchy had always been surrounded by symbolism, and this moment felt no different. Why would the Duke of Edinburgh, a man known for discipline and clarity, choose his youngest son over the reigning monarch to carry out his final wishes? Television panels and newspaper columns quickly filled with competing interpretations. Royal analysts, many of whom had spent years studying the internal dynamics of the royal family, began revisiting decades of history in search of clues. Some pointed toward Philip's pragmatic nature. Throughout his life, he had shown little patience for ceremonial expectations when he believed practicality served the monarchy better. From that perspective, naming Edward executor may have been nothing more than a calculated decision designed to avoid placing unnecessary legal responsibilities on the king. Others, however, viewed the situation through a more symbolic lens. In the monarchy, symbolism often carries extraordinary weight. Every title, gesture, and appointment can shape public perception in ways that echo far beyond the immediate moment. For those observers, Philip's decision felt layered with deeper meaning. If Charles had been the obvious choice, then bypassing him inevitably raised questions about the message the Duke intended to leave behind. Supporters of Edward were quick to highlight his reputation for reliability and discretion. For years, he had maintained a steady presence within the royal family without becoming entangled in the controversies that sometimes surrounded other members. His work had often unfolded quietly, away from dramatic headlines, focused on supporting royal initiatives and charitable causes. In that sense, Philip's decision appeared consistent with Edward's character. If the Duke had wanted someone dependable to oversee his final directives, Edward may have seemed like the most logical choice, yet not everyone interpreted the decision so simply. Some commentators began examining it as a potential reflection of deeper family dynamics. The royal family, like any family, has always contained a complex web of relationships shaped by personality, responsibility, and the pressures of public life. By naming Edward Executor, Philip may have been making a statement about trust, about who he believed could carry out sensitive tasks, without becoming distracted by the broader expectations attached to the crown. As the discussion unfolded, public curiosity only grew stronger. People began wondering what exactly Philip's documents might contain. Executors often oversee private correspondence, personal reflections, and historical records that remain sealed for years or even decades. If Philip had left behind such materials, Edward would now hold the responsibility of protecting them and potentially deciding when they might one day become public. This possibility added another layer of intrigue to the story, because while the executor role itself was already surprising, the documents it protected might hold insights into Philip's private thinking about the monarchy's past, present, and future. And for an institution built on both tradition and secrecy, the existence of those papers carried enormous significance. For the monarchy, the situation once again highlighted the delicate balance it constantly navigates. Transparency can strengthen public trust, but too much exposure can disrupt the carefully maintained dignity of royal life. Every decision about what to reveal and what to protect must be weighed with extraordinary care, and as journalists, historians, and royal watchers continued dissecting the story from every possible angle, one idea slowly began to emerge from the noise. Philip's final administrative decision might not simply be about who manages his estate. It might be about the legacy he intended to leave behind. And as the debate intensified, one final realization began to take shape. The executor decision might ultimately reveal more about Philip's legacy than anyone expected. In the end, the executor clause may not simply be about legal authority. For many observers, it feels like Philip's final statement about trust, responsibility, and the future of the royal family. By placing his faith in Edward, the Duke may have been sending a message that extended far beyond paperwork, a message about the quiet strength required to protect the monarchy itself. For most of his life, Prince Philip stood as one of the monarchy's most disciplined figures. He was not a man who chased public affection or carefully polished popularity. Instead, he believed in something far less glamorous, but far more enduring duty. Those who knew him well often described him as uncompromising in his expectations, both of himself and of the institution he had dedicated his life to serving. Decades at the center of royal life had taught him that the monarchy could only survive through resilience, structure, and a clear understanding of responsibility. That philosophy shaped nearly every decision he made, and in the final chapter of his life it appears to have shaped this one as well. By naming Edward as the sole executor of his estate, Philip left behind more than a legal instruction. He left behind a symbol. In a family defined by hierarchy, titles, and tradition, the smallest decision can echo through generations. Choosing Edward was not an act that elevated one son above another. Instead, it reflected the quiet qualities Philip seemed to value most: reliability, discretion, and the ability to act without seeking attention. Edward had spent years working within the monarchy without chasing the spotlight, and perhaps that steady presence was exactly what Philip believed the role required. There is something deeply revealing about that kind of trust. Leadership inside the royal family is not always measured by visibility or influence. Sometimes it is measured by the willingness to carry burdens that few people will ever see. By entrusting Edward with the responsibility of carrying out his final directives, Philip may have been demonstrating his belief that strength often exists in silence rather than spectacle. Yet the decision also highlights the intricate and often misunderstood nature of royal family relationships. From the outside, the monarchy can appear rigid and predictable. But in the family itself, bonds are shaped by decades of shared history, private conversations, and personal loyalties that the public rarely witnesses. Philip's choice reminds us that beneath the crown, the titles, and the centuries of tradition, there exists a family navigating its own complexities, sometimes harmonious, sometimes difficult, but always deeply human. For historians and royal observers, the Executor decision has already become another piece in the larger story of Philip's legacy. Over time, analysts will continue to debate what the Duke intended to communicate through this final administrative act. Was it simply a practical choice made by a man who valued efficiency, or was it a subtle reflection of his understanding of the family he left behind? The truth may never be entirely clear. What is certain, however, is that the monarchy continues to move forward, just as it always has. Institutions built over centuries rarely pause to reflect on a single moment, yet those moments quietly shape the future in ways that may only become visible years later. Philip understood that reality better than most. His life had been spent protecting an institution that survives not through dramatic gestures, but through careful decisions made long before their consequences are understood. And now, through Edward's role, one of those decisions has become part of the royal story. A final instruction from a man who believed that loyalty, discipline, and quiet strength were the pillars that would keep the monarchy standing long after he was gone. And perhaps that was Philip's final lesson, that the most powerful decisions in royal history are often the ones revealed only after the silence of farewell. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.